Good afternoon to everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you here today for our launch of the Caring for Boys Affected by Sexual Violence research in South Africa. My name is Rian Perry. I'm a criminal justice social worker. I work in a range of therapeutic and training environments, focusing on individuals and groups involved with concerning sexual behaviors and violence. I will be overseeing and moderating today's webinar for us. Before we start with the presentations, there are a few housekeeping points that I would just quickly like to run over. I want everyone to please take note that we are recording this session, just to make sure that everyone is comfortable with that. Then we would like to really encourage your interaction. So please make use of the chat functions during the presentation. I will try to make notes of questions that are posted there. Hopefully I won't miss too many of them. And we can go through some of them during our discussion later on. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to write down your questions that you have as the presentations continue. And when we give you an opportunity, you guys can raise your hands and hopefully we'll be able to give everyone a chance to post some of their questions or to present some of their questions. We are very thankful for the large number of people that are present here today. And we want to kindly ask to avoid unnecessary interruptions, that you guys ensure to please keep your videos off and that your microphones remain muted during the presentations. Should there be any delays or technical difficulties during the presentations, please remain patient while our team sort it out. I'm sure that we all are getting used to this format. The last year, we've been doing it more and more. But there are still times with difficulties with weather and with load shedding playing a role. Without any further ado, I would like to introduce you to the presenters for the day, after which they are going to get going with the program. Our first presenter is Lopa Bhattacharjee. She works for the Global Alliance Family for Every Child as the Senior Program Advisor, managing portfolios of preventing sexual violence against children, reintegration, and child participation. Lopa has over 21 years of experience working with a range of organizations, networks, and government systems on violence against children, child protection, and apologies, child protection and safeguardings in countries of Asia and other parts of the world. Prior to joining Family for Every Child, Lopa headed the protection program in Terra des Hommes Foundation in India. Lopa started her career as a social worker, supporting children affected by trafficking and child exploitation. This enabled her deeper understanding on the need of children to grow up in safe and caring families. Lopa also currently co-chairs the CSO Task Force for Engaging Children and Young People in the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child Day, of general discussions on children's rights and alternative care. Lopa lives in India. Our second presenter for the day is Suzanne Klulo. She is the Child Advocacy Program Manager at CINDI, through which she is involved in networking, training, child participation, research, and advocacy with other organizations, parents, caregivers, and children. She has a master's degree in international relations from St. Andrews University in Scotland and has been working in the NGO sector for over 20 years. She's passionate about children, in particularly ensuring that enough is invested through policy and practice to support children growing up in safe and nurturing families. Our next presenter will be Dr. Joan van Niekerk. Dr. van Niekerk currently works as a child rights consultant to organizations working in child protection and with adult survivors of abuse. Her recent work includes working on the South African Law Reform Commission Project Committee on Child Pornography. She is a former president of the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect and has served in numerous key positions within NGOs and expert advisory groups in relation to child protection. She holds a PhD in social work. Our final presenter for the day is Dumisile Nala. She holds a bachelor's degree in social work and has practiced in multidisciplinary settings in both South Africa and the UK, where she has gained extensive knowledge in child protection, child mental health, foster care, and adoption. Since 2009, she has served as the National Executive Officer of Childline South Africa. Ms. Nala hopes to, in her lifetime still, see a continent that joins forces in the protection of the African child and the upholding of the African child's rights. She's a member of the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect, has served on the executive committee of the Yesengani Network and the Shukumisa Steering Committee. Now, we are starting with Lopa, who will be introducing Family for Every Child. She will provide background to the Caring for Boys research, an overview of the research findings in other countries. Thank you, Lopa.
Thank you, Rian. Thank you very much for the introductions. Hello, everybody. I'm just trying to transfer. As Rian mentioned, my name is Lopa Bhattacharjee, and I work as the Senior Program Advisor in Family for Every Child. Family for Every Child is a diverse global alliance of 41 local civil society organizations in 37 countries. As an alliance, we work with the millions of children in extended family, alternative care, detention, and those on the move or without adequate care in their own families. Our goals are to prevent family separation, strengthening families, ensuring high quality alternative care when needed, and protecting children outside of any care. All our members are deeply rooted where they work, so their model for change grow directly out of the needs of their unique communities. Together as an alliance, we deliver collaborative projects that deliver impact and change at a larger scale than our members could do separately. These include global campaigns and advocacy, international research, and program pilots to achieve change in multiple countries. Two of our campaigns around prevention of sexual violence against children were United for Boys, launched in 2019, and the ongoing campaign called the Blue Umbrella Day, which was launched earlier this year on 16th of April. These campaigns are drawn out of the findings and recommendations from the global and primary research concluded so far that I would be sharing in a while. Our two other campaigns are focused on the topics of children on the move and kinship care. Family for Every Child also implements the RISE Learning Network that promotes and facilitates learning on recovery and reintegration for children and adolescents affected by sexual exploitation. This is a space for our community members to connect with each other, share information, and generate knowledge. We are currently strategizing to broaden the scope of the space for all these pieces around the work related to sexual violence affecting children. Let me talk a little bit about the context of the Caring for Boys research globally. A group of Family for Every Child member organizations met in the Philippines in February 2017 for a practice exchange on child sexual abuse. The purpose was to gain a better understanding on how social norms around gender influence care for boys affected by sexual violence and what is already being done to ensure that boys affected by sexual violence grow up in a permanent, safe, and caring family. Well, the first stage was to develop and publish a global scoping study entitled Caring for Boys Affected by Sexual Violence. And this was published in 2018, followed by our United for Boys Charter to generate awareness globally on this important issue and call for action and support from different stakeholders. A reference group of Family for Every Child member organizations with expertise on the topic proposed and guided the design of this study. This included Family for Every Child members, CPTCA, called the Center for Prevention and Treatment of Child Sexual Abuse in the Philippines, First Step Cambodia, Voice of Children in Nepal, Butterflies in India, and Muhammadiyah in Indonesia. A bit of the design, methodology, and ethics. The study sought to answer two broad questions. What global, regional, or country-specific knowledge exists on the drivers of sexual violence affecting boys? And some of the sub-questions focused around culture, context, social norms around gender, and the role of parents and caregivers. And the second broad question was what promising or best practice intervention exists with evidence of demonstrable effectiveness. This study explored both sexual abuse experienced by boys, including sexual exploitation and harmful sexual behavior of boys. These are referred to collectively in the report as sexual violence. Now, why did we consider both? By considering both in this study, the aim is not to imply that one leads to the other. Boys who have experienced sexual abuse and boys who have been actors in harmful sexual behavior share a number of indicators such as sexualized behavior and using sexual language, as well as risk and resilience factors. Many of the interventions to address child sexual abuse and harmful sexual behavior of children are delivered by the same service providers, although requiring different approaches. This has been discussed elaborately in this report. A bit about the terminology of harmful sexual behavior. This was used with the understanding that the study would enable further consideration of different terms that would be used to describe such behavior by Family for Every Child's members. The reference group of members reviewed the definitions of harmful sexual behavior and related terms identified through the study, and agreed the following working definitions to be used in the following primary research. As mentioned on the slide, harmful sexual behavior is sexual activity where one individual has not consented or where the relationship includes an imbalance of power, for example, due to age, intellectual ability, physical ability or impairment, or physical strength. This study comprised a review of over 100 documents in English, Spanish, and French, and 20 semi-structured key informant interviews. The literature was identified through key informant interviews, Family for Every Child member organizations, and searches of websites and resource databases. Search terms were chosen to ensure a focus on boys rather than girls or adult men. Priority was given to literature and evidence gathered in low and middle income contexts to reduce the dominance of evidence from high income contexts where more research is conducted. Key informants were identified from within and outside the Family for Every Child Alliance, and interviews took place with the member organizations of the Alliance, other local and national civil society or non-governmental organizations, and international NGOs and consultants who are experts on this field. This also, of course, included CINDI among other member organizations of the Alliance. Sampling was purposive and based on key informants, relevant knowledge and experience. An ethical protocol was designed for and used in the study, drawing upon Family for Every Child's child safeguarding policy and standards for consultation and research and governing confidentiality, consent, and data protection. We made the conscious decision not to consult children and families in this study because children and families were to participate in the primary research, which were to be followed in the next stage. And also because research and consultations on sexual violence are highly sensitive, as we all know, and requiring more time to be invested in the design of tools and ethical procedures than a study such as this could allow. Some of the broad findings from the global scoping study include the fact that sexual violence affecting boys remain largely unknown, unacknowledged, and non-responded to. Addressing gendered social norms is critical as they influence perceptions of boys' vulnerability, obstruct disclosure, identification, and recognition of harm caused and support needed. Some groups of boys are at heightened risk, including those with inadequate care. There is value in interventions addressing risk factors in boys' identity and environment, including the family. Sexual violence can be a cause or consequence of family separation. A focus on prevention of family separation and reintegration within interventions to address sexual violence is required. Child protection systems need to better meet the needs of boys affected by sexual violence. Response services appear to be lacking for boys, and their modality may not be appealing to them, but it is unclear whether separate interventions are needed or not. Any intervention needs to be scalable and involve children in design. Among the many recommendations, some of the highlighted ones, which is provided in the slides, are in-depth qualitative research with meaningful participation from boys, parents, caregivers, and members of the community is needed. And further learning through research and well-evaluated pilot interventions is needed to understand which ones are effective for boys at risk or affected by sexual violence in specific settings. Very quickly about the other research, the primary research which have been conducted in 4 Asia countries of India, Nepal, Philippines, and Cambodia, and Zimbabwe, which has been recently completed. As mentioned, one of the key conclusions of the global desk scoping study was to need for further primary research, and that is how we followed this path of the primary research. And the whole aspect was to better understand the dynamics of sexual violence in relation to boys, as well as to generate information on appropriate interventions. A collective approach from the outset of the research was taken to the design and methodology, and which enabled the development of action-oriented studies, which met the needs of the member organizations involved. And these designs were adapted and contextualized for each of the countries. The overall purpose of the research was to conduct participatory research to identify common and context-specific knowledge on how boys become victims of sexual abuse or engage in harmful sexual behavior, identify interventions that have been shown to be effective or have strong potential for preventing and responding to sexual abuse and sexually harmful behavior of boys, including therapeutic approaches to working with children and families, raise awareness of this important issue, and influence practice around the world. The research design was qualitative in nature, utilizing a range of participatory techniques alongside traditional data collection methods such as key informants interview, individual interview, extended interviews, and focus group discussions. The aim of taking this approach was not to show the size of the problem, but instead to gain an in-depth and contextualized understanding of the drivers of sexual violence as it affects individual boys and those around them. Thus, the study emphasized rigor in its approach to ethics and the recruitment of and engagement with research participants. A research protocol and ethical protocol were developed for the study, informed by in-country risk assessments and Family for Every Child's ethics checklist. Researchers who were the existing staff of the organizations were trained on the protocols and were reference checked. They were briefed and required to sign the member organization's child safeguarding policies. In addition, members had to get approval from their local national authorities. CINDI, along with its partner Childline and Family for Every Child members in Zimbabwe and Guyana, joined this journey. These 3 mentioned country research are also now based on the same collective approach of design and methodology with the necessary adaptation to meet the specific needs of each country context. Very quickly, the key findings: the fact that the notion of real man that boys are expected to become emerged clearly from each of the studies. These were characterized as courageous and independent real men are not only physically strong, but emotionally strong too, and implying that there is pressure to not display feelings that might indicate vulnerability. The studies also indicated that physical violence is an accepted expression of being a strong, brave man, and that aggressive behavior in boys is not only tolerated by, but also taught, for example, through receiving harsher physical discipline in the family than girls. All the 4 studies individually and all together have pointed out several possible links of moving a boy from sexual experimentation to inappropriate and possibly harmful sexual behavior. One is the patriarchal gender expectation placed on boys that include physical and emotional strength, with violence playing a large role in relationships. 2 is that strength assumes males can take care of themselves in vulnerable situations, and indeed that they must individually be able to physically care for their family and community as well. And the 3rd is the assumption that they will have a family to physically care for, which implies the knowledge and ability to have sex and procreate. And the 4th is the implicit importance of the female as a primary procreator who has been relegated as weak and thus less than a male. Acceptance of violence in multiple situations of anger in intimate sexual relationships revealed the way varying forms of violence were normalized. The findings also reflect how heterosexuality is being defined and shaped by patriarchal values, wherein extra and or premarital sex and violence are perceived as acceptable amongst males and as part of masculinity. And you will get to hear more of these similar findings from the South Africa research. And so I will stop here for now. And before I end, I would also like to invite you to our social network called the Changemakers for Platform. And you are cordially invited to join the platform. It provides the opportunity to engage in different topics. This includes a dedicated space also for the Blue Umbrella Day campaign that I mentioned earlier, and also other resources around sexual violence and related ones to care of children. We also encourage you to join our RISE learning community. Thank you very much for listening. And now I will hand over the floor to Suzanne, who will be our next presenter. Suzanne, over to you.
Thanks, Lopa, and it's great to be here with everybody. My name is Suzanne Clulo. I'm the Child Advocacy Program Manager at the Children in Distress Network, or CINDI. We've just received notification that it seemed there was a limit on our Zoom account, which we had not expected. We've just lifted that limit to allow more people to join. So if you have colleagues who have not yet been able to join, please do let them know that they should now be able to sign into the webinar. I have been fielding a few queries from people, so hopefully I see the numbers are going up. Hopefully people will now be able to join us. I am going to introduce you to the South African research that we carried out here. I was the principal researcher for this, and I was supported and assisted through Childline and Dr. Joan van Niekerk, who will also be presenting later. Lopa, if you can move on to the next slide, please. Lopa's already presented the context and the background to the wider global study. And specifically in South Africa, these were the research questions that we chose to focus on. We were looking at how masculinity and sexuality are socially constructed in South Africa, and how these dominant notions of masculinity and sexuality reflect in the lived experiences of boys. We also looked at what the links between the dominant notions of sexuality and masculinity are in relation to the sexual abuse of boys, but also in relation to harmful sexual behaviors in which boys are actors. And the last area that we looked at were what interventions are currently available for boys who are both affected by abuse, but also who are actors in sexual abuse. What are people's experiences of accessing this support, and what are the gaps in interventions? Next slide, please. As I mentioned previously, the research was a collaboration between CINDI and Childline. It was set up in this way to maximize CINDI's experience in research, but also Childline's experience in working with boys affected by harmful sexual behavior. We obtained ethical clearance. The research did involve children who are a particularly sensitive group ethically. So we obtained ethical clearance for the study from the HSRC Research Ethics Committee. And we chose 2 research sites, predominantly because of Childline's existing work in those areas, one in Limpopo and one in KwaZulu-Natal. The research was qualitative, so we were focusing on getting people's personal and lived experiences around the questions that we were asking. We didn't ask specific questions about people's experiences of sexual violence, but we were looking at their understanding of masculinity and sexuality as outlined in the key research questions. And the data collection that we carried out involved a literature review of the most recent available literature. In some instances, we did go back quite a way because of the topics that we were looking at and the availability of current literature around that. And we also carried out focus group discussions with mothers and boys and girls who were from the general population, so not assumed to be affected by sexual violence, although may possibly have been. And then individual interviews with boys who have been affected by sexual violence, their caregivers, which basically were all female. We didn't sample exclusively for females, but that was what we ended up receiving in that group. So we then carried out separate individual interviews with men because we wanted to make sure that we didn't exclude their voice from the research. And we also spoke to experts both in Limpopo and KZN and also nationally who have experience in working with boys affected by sexual violence or have carried out other research around sexual violence, masculinity and fatherhood. Next slide, please. Because we were working with children and also because the topic that we were looking at is so sensitive, we wanted to ensure that we used participatory tools which maximize their participation, but also provided opportunities to talk about sensitive subjects in ways that might be less threatening and would also allow for emotional distance. So we had a series of participatory tools. You can see a few of them on the slide. And we also, when we carried out the individual interviews, those were conducted by social workers who had an existing trusted relationship with the boys. An individual risk assessment was carried out for each child as well, just to ensure that there was no risk of further harm from participating in the research. The social workers that carried out the interviews were all experienced in the field, and they did also receive an additional 3-day training specific to this research. The recordings from the interviews that we carried out were translated and transcribed. And then we carried out a thematic analysis of that data to identify patterns and themes. Next slide, please. So it's important, obviously, to always highlight the limitations of the research. And obviously, the first one relates to the representativity of the research. Whilst we didn't specifically sample for race group, because of the target group of Childline's existing programs, the research did exclusively target one race group in South Africa. That's not to imply that other race groups are not affected. In fact, the research strongly shows that sexual violence affects boys and girls across all racial groups. But that was just the limitation for our research sites. We also made note of the fact that a lot of effort was made to depersonalize and to provide emotional distance in the questioning, but trauma affects people differently, and it's very possible that for some participants, the questions were still too close to their personal experience, and this may have affected the way in which they answered the questions. And we did note that in a few responses, it wasn't consistent across all the groups, but we did note that in a few of the responses. Next slide, please. So before we start looking at the findings, I just want to highlight a few key findings that were raised through the literature review. There is a fuller literature review available in the research, but it's probably important to situate this research in some of the context of some excellent already existing research, Shanaz Matthews, Kathy Ward, Andy Dawes, Linda Richter, to name a few South African researchers. So the UBS Optima study, which is one of the first nationally representative studies on child sexual abuse that we have in South Africa, shows that 36.8% of boys report some form of sexual abuse. And this is actually higher than what was reported by girls, which I think was surprising for many because people tend to consider girls more affected, and that comes out in our research. Childhood sexual abuse is a risk factor for experiencing and perpetrating other forms of violence, and that these links are significant, particularly for boys. Personal norms about inequitable gender relationships and views on rape are also significant determinants in violence perpetration with boys. The quality of female caregivers' relationship with their child is a protective factor, and you'll see why this becomes significant later when we look at our findings. Boys generally report experiencing more non-contact sexual abuse and coercion. They also tend to externalize their responses to violence and victimizing behavior. And also boys' experiences of sexual abuse are not always identified as abusive. And lastly, peer pressure has a significant influence in forcing boys to engage in unwanted sex or in harmful sexual behavior towards others. Next slide, please, Lopa. So I'm just going to run over, I'm going to cover the findings on the masculinity and sexuality side, and then I will hand over to Joan, who will be doing the other two topics we looked at. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first finding that we had around how masculinity and sexuality are socially constructed is that men, women, boys and girls across all the respondents group, the view of what it means to be male was very, very, I mean, you can't really say very, very uniform, but it was incredibly uniform. So it was really consistent across all groups and consistently described. And so we sort of dubbed this the 5 Ps. Men are seen as preferred, powerful, providers, protectors, and procreators. The patriarchal society is still very strong. The man is considered the head of all things. And he is also expected to get married, to provide for his family, to build a house, and to take on the responsibility of protecting and looking after that family moving forward. And within this, boyhood also has its own social construction, which is generally in preparation for manhood, but also has some specific constructions of its own. So there are very specific tasks within the household and the community that are considered boys' work. The respect of elders is very important, it's highly valued. And also boyhood often characterized by extreme competition within peer groups, which was referred to in the literature review as something called hypermasculinity. And this will come up later when we look at how this affects boys in terms of their vulnerability to sexual abuse. Next slide, please, Lopa. So real men are heterosexual. Homosexuality was seen as unacceptable, unnatural, something that's learned or a disease. And male sexuality was defined in relation to social constructs of masculinity, for example, sexual virility. And similarly, boys' relationships with girls were defined along these same lines. So boys were considered power holders in the relationship. They made the choices. They could come and go as they pleased in the relationship, and they could also have more than one sexual partner, but girls could not have similar sexual relationships. Boys learn about masculinity mostly at home and mostly from men, either their father or what we refer to as social fathers, who are other male relatives or other men within their community, who are commonly referred to as uncles, but they don't need to be related by blood. This quote underneath says, there's an isiZulu saying that says, the road to walk is guided by those that have been on a similar road before. Interestingly, boys learn about sexuality mostly outside of the home. And the most common place that boys referred to learning about sexuality was the media, and a concerning number mentioned exploring pornography. Next slide, please. Men and boys experience a lot of pressure to perform, and this starts from a very early age. They described feeling pressure from high expectations of responsibility and success that are placed on them. But interestingly, at the same time, the lived identities of men and boys are very different to what is idealized. So males were often referred to as violent, disrespectful, stupid, stubborn, money-wasting substance abusers. And yet the expectations that were placed on them were almost the extreme opposite of this. You can see there in some of the quotes, they say that boys are dogs, they are not loved, and men are abusive drunkards and problematic people in society. Next slide, please. So how are these notions reflected in boys' lived experiences? One of the first things that was very evident was that mothers find it harder to connect with and parent their sons. But conversely, boys consider their mothers a very close source of support. And it was almost as if mothers felt disempowered by nature of being female to be able to parent their boys. And this disempowerment was often linked to the absence of a father. The involvement of men in the lives of boys is very important. And as I mentioned previously, this does not have to be by the biological father, but can also be played through the role of a social father. So another male person connected to the boy, or actually just a male community member. Boys and mothers both recognize that social norms around masculinity can sometimes be harmful. So for example, boys are given a lot more freedom than girls, but they experience this freedom. They talk about experiencing this freedom as a lack of care. And mothers also notice that the focus on girls as exclusively vulnerable often denies boys an adequate response. So we are too overprotective when it comes to female children, and we think that the male children are male and therefore can take care of themselves. Next slide, please. And how do these constructs reflect in the sexuality of the lived experience of boys? Early sexual debut is recognized, but it is not desirable or acknowledged by the adults that we interviewed. Whereas interestingly, amongst the peer groups of boys, there was a lot of pressure on boys to engage in sexual activities from a young age. So there's almost this discrepancy between what is acceptable and actually what is happening. Sex was often also referenced alongside childbearing rather than love and affection, and so was linked mostly to concerns around the physical outcomes for a girl in terms of pregnancy or sexually transmitted infections. Many boys referred to being involved with pornography, and there seemed to be little to no parental supervision of online use. And there also was a sharing of pornographic photos or sharing of graphic images amongst the boys. And the one caregiver shared the story about how this led actually to a stabbing in their community. I think the quote refers to a fight, but she goes on to say that the one boy stabbed another boy because he was sharing photos of his girlfriend on social media. Mothers find it hard to talk to their sons about sex, and they would prefer this was done by an outside person. And also boys are not considered to have control of their sexual urges. So a lot of sexually inappropriate behavior was blamed on hormones or uncontrollable sexual urges or peer pressure or drink, but very little blame was placed on, well, not blame, but very little emphasis was placed on the agency of the boy to be in control of his sexual urges. And I think that that concludes my section. I shall hand over to Joan now to continue with the findings.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thanks for setting the scene for that. I just want to say I'm struggling with electricity, which hasn't come on as it should have at 12:30. If I disappear, I will just ask either Suzanne or Demasile to seamlessly pick up. So let's look at the findings, social constructs in relation to sexual violence in boys. How do dominant notions of sexuality and masculinity link to the sexual abuse of boys? And I think one really important finding is that boys were not seen as able, as needing as much supervision as girls. They were seen as able to look after themselves and take responsibility for protecting themselves. And I think this is concerning. It does lead to increased vulnerability of boys. Sexual abuse in general is not well understood, and even less so for boys. And grooming was understood as possibly leading on to a fuller sexual relationship between the groomer and the child. But it wasn't recognized as sexual abuse in and of itself. So exposing a child to pornography or asking a child to undress was not necessarily seen as abuse in itself. A male is not a person created to be penetrated. So there was almost a denial that sexual abuse of boys or penetration of boys could take place. Very limited knowledge of how sexual abuse of boys can actually take place. Boys were also thought to be less harmed by sexual abuse than girls. The focus was more on the physical consequences, but not the emotional consequences. So for girls, there was the concern of pregnancy and STIs, sexually transmitted infections. And the comment was made, it is worse for women. It's worse because they are abused in the same area that they need for giving birth. So it was almost like this procreation thing that was really seen as important, not the emotional harm that children experience. So little acknowledgement of emotional trauma of sexual abuse for either boys or girls. Sexually transmitted infections were recognized as being a risk for girls, but not recognized as a possibility for boys at all. Again, concerning in terms of the care of boys who are subjected to some form of harmful sexual behavior. Next slide, please. So, how do dominant notions of sexuality and masculinity link to this harmful sexual behavior of boys? And harmful sexual behavior between boys was often linked to homosexuality. And that was a very strong link that emerged frequently in the research. And there were some confusions around male physiology. I found this very interesting, such as anal penetration can rupture the appendix. Almost a lack of understanding of how your physical body works in actual practice. When psychological consequences were recognized, these were most frequently associated with the taboo on homosexuality. It's much worse because in the end, this child growing up would end up attracted to males. He would not have grown up to have a feeling for males. He will end up now believing that he is a female and it's all right for him to sleep with males. And homosexuality was also confused with, well, one party must have, or both parties must have, a female psyche. Their masculinity shifts into a femininity. Rather than seeing men as two men who may, in actual fact, have a sexual attraction to each other. So moving on to the next slide. Failure to disclose harmful sexual behavior, or being the victim of harmful sexual behavior, was linked to negative consequences. Failure to disclose abuse was linked to a number of negative consequences for the victim, such as poor self-esteem and self-confidence. It was further recognized that these negative consequences should extend through adulthood. The more you are silent about what upsets you, it's the more it hurts you psychologically. Psychologically, you can end up as a drug addict whilst you avoid thinking about what has happened. The other thing that was seen as important here is boys need to have sex to prove themselves. And this came up with the notions of masculinity that Suzanne has already discussed. Peer pressure appears to play a considerable role in sexual activity, to the extent that several boys referred to feeling forced to engage in what was sometimes violent sex with girls in order to prove themselves. So the issue of peer pressure was talked about because his friends are laughing at him, saying he's never had sex. That might cause someone to want to have sex so bad that he ends up even raping a girl. Next slide, please. So support and interventions were the next area that were explored in this research. What support and interventions do communities in Limpopo and KwaZulu-Natal, what are they aware of? Next slide, please. So sexual violence was recognized as wrong, but not always reported. People mentioned shock, anger, hurt, and betrayal as common responses to sexual violence, but there was some disagreement over what should be done. Some believed that one should deal with this entirely within the family. It can be resolved between the two families. The parents are supposed to meet and talk about it and then sit the offending youth down and give him counseling. They should try and show him the dangers of this act and where he can end up. That resolution between the families also sounded somewhat, although it was not mentioned, related to the payment of damages. One is uncertain about that. It was not specifically mentioned. Other options were discussed, such as reporting to the police, social workers. A few people felt keeping quiet was acceptable. These responses were mostly linked to feelings of shame. The potential for family conflict was recognized. And possible barriers to reporting included disbelief and social taboos around homosexuality, and the anticipation of poor service provider response. It was clear that some families, some respondents in this research had or had heard of poor responses from some of the service providers who might be involved, such as clinics, DSD, etc. Next slide, please. The other interesting finding was that boys are sometimes blamed for being victims of abuse. They're surely able to protect themselves. And the victim blaming was quite subtle, but came across consistently in some of the responses. In other words, the right way would have been for the victim to leave the offender and go back home. In other words, believing that boy victims can kind of extricate themselves from the abusive situation and return home if they were not at home, or leave the room, or do something that would have protected themselves. What was interesting is that people know where to get help in their communities. They know about community resources. So this is a very positive finding. Next slide, please. Families were not always seen as sources of help. There were a number of views on discussing abusive relationships within families, and these views were mixed. Some felt it was helpful, that families would be supportive. Some felt talking to the family would be unhelpful. They would blame the child. There would be a lack of confidentiality. uncles in the community were seen as a source of help. Now, the issue with uncles is something that is quite interesting. Were these perhaps siblings of parents who were around in the community, or were these uncles more generally seen as other men in the community, not necessarily related, but able to offer help and support? Boys might find disclosure to families difficult and fear being blamed. I do not normally share my problems with my families, and because you can tell one person and they can pass it on to others. Some felt it was much easier for boys to talk to trusted friends. It's easier to talk to a friend because they are mentally in the same age group and they can understand each other. Siblings were also seen as playing a big role in supporting their friends and other siblings because parents are not easy to speak to about these things. Peer groups were sometimes seen as helpful, sometimes seen as unhelpful. I can remember one response which talked about the possibility of one's peers laughing at one if one was actually a victim of sexual abuse. External sources of support, childline and social workers, were seen as helpful in this research. Next slide, please. So, what support are seen and interventions are seen as available to boys who are actors in harmful sexual behavior? Male responses towards active focus on punitive measures. One saw the family as possibly being quite punitive towards boys involved in harmful sexual behavior, possibly being socially excluded, possible threats and violence. The responses from females were more gentle and proposed more relational and correctional responses. But some of the responses were based on a lack of knowledge of sexual functioning. For example, you need to remind him that his body parts are not to be used at once and be finished. They are there for the rest of his life. He must not be in a hurry to use them, otherwise he will end up abusing them. Some interventions that were shared were both helpful and unhelpful. Families, friends, and community members were seen as potentially helpful. Trust was seen as very important in order to enable disclosure and helpful interventions. Community meetings were seen as possibly very helpful interventions and used in a way in which information was shared about sexual abuse and harmful sexual behavior. Life skills education in schools was mentioned as very important as a source of information and help. External support such as the childline boys camps and mediation were seen as very relevant. And this was quite interesting because some of the mothers whose children had attended the childline boys camps talked about the changes in their boys, how they were more helpful at home and how they were easier to talk to. Harsh punishment was generally seen.
One more minute.
Thank you, Rian. Was not seen as useful. A stick will never speak the truth was one comment that we thought was very telling. Next slide, please. So discussion and analysis, risk and protective factors were identified. Sorry, Rian, I have an extra slide here allocated to me. Protective factors were identified, such as parental knowledge about sexual violence, having a trusted friend or confidant. This was highly valued by both adults and children. There were responsive parent-child relationships that were talked about. The importance of parental supervision, instruction, and care for boys was acknowledged by many, as well as open communication and spending time with boys that would eventually enable were seen as enabling factors in prevention and disclosure. Life skills programs at school I've mentioned, the involvement of fathers and social fathers. These were seen as having very important roles. And responsive community-based support for boys affected by sexual violence and their families was seen as really important. But there had to be confidentiality, there had to be knowledge, there had to be informed responses important in service provision. And that ends my part of the presentation, and I'll pass on to Dumasile.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm hoping you can hear me and you can also see me. Rian, if you can confirm, please.
Yes, Dumi, we can hear you and we can see you.
Thank you. So I'm going to focus on risk factors, and then I will close with the recommendations. And some of the risk factors, as you will see, have to some extent been identified as we were going through the presentations. And they include little parental supervision of television and online use. So we noted that there was lack of online safety and supervision and the normalization of pornography. And of course, we understand that some parents are not at home most of the time, so children somehow are able to use online platforms, including television, unsupervised. Lack of quality, accessible childcare options. There's limited choices for quality childcare, particularly for older children. And few adults expected sexual violence to take place in the context of trusted relationships. But of course, as we know from research and from experience in practice, violence actually happens within the context of trusted relationships. Enforcing respect and obedience to elders. In our society, norms of respect for elders can make it difficult for children to refuse sexual advances or remove themselves from an abusive situation if the actor or perpetrator is older. Hierarchies of masculinity, male on male relationship characterized by teasing, ridicule, and social exclusion. And I think this was highlighted when Joan was making her presentation. And masculine hierarchies of power may place some boys more at risk than others. And this is a correlation between boys being shorter for their age and increased risk of child sexual abuse. And we saw this in terms of the study from Richter in 2018. Next slide, please. We also, in terms of the risk factors, identified high levels of violence. Violence was pervasive in the data at many levels. Boys need to be seen as victims too, where violence is perpetrated by other males, girls, and mothers. And when violence is perpetrated by girls and mothers, we tend not to discuss that or see that in terms of the discussions that are taking place. Greater freedom given to boys, lack of parental supervision and involvement, a sense of boys can look after themselves because they are boys and they have the physical strength. and this exposes them to risk of exposure to violence, drugs, and alcohol. The polarized view of boys and girls, and that limited spaces for alternative discourse about gender and sexuality. And the grooming and non-contact sexual abuse is not always recognized. Sexual violence, mostly limited to penetrative acts, in turn limited to the rape of girls. And this is what people tend to think about. And grooming was seen as wrong and harmful, but less so for boys than girls. And this, of course, is highlighted throughout the report. And there was also a little understanding of non-contact sexual abuse, although literature review foregrounds a greater risk for boys for non-contact sexual abuse and coercion. So these, in essence, were the risk factors that we identified. The next slide, please. Now there is more. Focus on girls only as vulnerable denies boys an adequate response. And the research also highlights some of the family interactions which focuses more on boys, more on girls than boys. So the adequate response is, or inadequate response is experienced within the family home, and also interventions by civil society and other government departments. Focus only on the physical outcomes of abuse, focus on physical harm, limits the harm to girls and penetrative sexual violence. This further distances the abuse of boys from being recognized as harmful. Sex and sexuality are not talked about at home, and this is an ongoing issue as highlighted, and some parents indicated that they would prefer, or they prefer that the schools and social workers discuss such matters with their children. The absence of responsive and appropriately resourced structures in communities. There's a need for external support for parents, caregivers, and children to facilitate and advise on appropriate responses to the challenges of parenting boys and girls, of course, and the management of emerging sexual maturity and harmful sexual behavior if and when it occurs. Next slide, please. So now looking at the recommendations based on the work that was done. The recommendations focus on recommendations for families. We looked at recommendations for community members, for the media, for civil society, and also for government. So focusing on communities, on families, it is our view that families should be enabled through a supportive policy and service delivery environment to carry out their parental and caregiving responsibilities in ensuring that boys and girls' online and media use is safe, monitored, restricted to age-appropriate content, and that children know where to seek help if they are exposed to harm online. Ensure that boys and girls are kept emotionally and physically safe, and when their safety is in danger, appropriate help is sought. Again, throughout the report and in discussions with parents in particular, it's interesting that parents find it easier to provide emotional and physical safety to girls compared to boys, because boys are seen to be able to fend for themselves, really. For both boys and girls, spending time with them, talking to them, and taking interest in their activities, their friends, their hopes and dreams, and supporting them in good and bad times. So really having those relationships and engagements with the children is important. Recommendations for community members, cultural and religious leaders. We believe that ensuring rites of passage, which help boys and girls transition from childhood into early adulthood, provide accurate and appropriately messaged information around gender, sexual orientation, sex, and relationships, so as to avoid reinforcing harmful social norms and protect the rights of all children. Next slide, please. And also to specifically recognize the differing vulnerabilities and trauma responses of boys and girls to sexual violence, address gendered social norms which contribute to these vulnerabilities, and have specific safeguarding policies and procedures in place for boys and girls. That we need to provide community education on the different sexual acts that constitute sexual violence as per the Criminal Law Sexual Offences Amendment Act 5 of 2015, including both contact and non-contact sexual acts, how boys and girls may be vulnerable to and affected by these crimes in different ways, and the reporting obligations and responsibilities of community members and families outlined in South African legislation. Also to deepen understanding amongst families and communities of the long-term physical, emotional, and psychosocial impact of sexual violence on both boys who are victims as well as those who are actors, and the roles families can play in their healing. Also recognize the differing parenting needs of boys and girls, and to encourage the caregiving involvement of fathers, not just their financial provision, and to promote responsive parenting and the elimination of harsh discipline. So definitely for civil society, there's a lot that we need to think about as we plan our interventions and working with communities. And next slide, looking at recommendations for the media. And we believe that the media, in particular local media, must
we have 2 minutes left.
Okay, I think I also have 1 or 2 slides. Must accept their responsibility in ensuring content is safe for children and does not perpetuate gender social norms which increase boys and girls' vulnerability. And lastly, the recommendations for government. We always speak about intersectoral and multifaceted violence prevention policies and programming. Please go back to the previous slide. And we need to ensure that there's adequate resources for programs that work with boys who are victims and actors, and not only focus on girls. Next slide, please. And of course, we need to ensure that life orientation programs in schools, they continue. We need to make sure that these timetables or these lessons are ring-fenced and are taught by skilled teachers who have the ability to engage young people so they can participate accordingly and share their experiences in a safe environment. And of course, I think this is the last point. We need to ensure that corporal punishment in the home is prohibited as per the current amendments to the Children's Act. And also that appropriate policies and services are developed, budgeted for, and implemented at the scale required to support responsive parenting and positive discipline in families for the safeguarding of both boys and girls from conception to adulthood. I think that is as far as our recommendations go. Thank you, Rhian.
Thank you very much, Julie. Listening to the presenters, talking on this very relevant topic, I cannot help but think, how we can use this and what we, the practitioners on the ground, can do. What really stood out for me, as you guys went through the findings, is this massive need to enhance the involvement and the engagement of caregivers, in the lives of the boys in their care. This should include empowering them in engaging with boys, engaging with all children, but specifically with boys, and creating a space for a dialogue on sexual matters, within the family or within the care home environment. Including the boy's responsibility, in sexual relationships, and talking about safety matters, access to pornography. I also noticed, from listening to the presentations, the relevance of us continuing to challenge normative gender roles. And I think this research shows again that this idea of masculinity or being a real man, which is generally accepted out there, is not the reality for many, and we see this once we engage with men and boys in a more protective space. Now, I think looking at these, two aspects of family involvement and masculinity, I find it worrying that family members, mothers, fathers, uncles, and caregivers, they play such a major role in the idea of sexual and gender roles, but not actually in aspects of safety and protection regarding sexual behaviors, at least for boys. Including having a space for disclosure. I do not think that these aspects of masculinity and sexual behavior should be dealt with, separately or exclusively. I think if you can, raise your boy in a certain way, you should, when it comes to masculinity and gender, you should also be involving, the talk on sexual behaviors and safety aspects. I think my final thought, listening to the presentation, and we're going to go on to the questions soon, is this idea of what is actually seen as sexual abuse or sexual violence against boys, especially by the victims themselves. This idea of it being limited to sexual penetration only, while we know that a lot of it is grooming, different levels of sexual assault, and different forms of exploitation, including the non-contact exploitation and coercion. Over social media, for example, of which I think the full extent is not nearly known. Considering these things, with us, the work that we do, it's important that those we work with, the families we work with, the boys at risk, and also society, in general, we have to, enhance the understanding of these things, of this reality, that there are ranges of different forms of sexual violence against boys. And I think this is important for preventative purposes, but it's also important so that actual victims know that they are allowed to speak out when it comes to something that's not just, penetrative sexual abuse or sexual violence. Thank you very much to all the presenters and everyone involved in this research project. And I think thank you to everyone that's involved in services, these kind of services to boys all over the world. So now we have time for some questions and answers. We have about 30 minutes that we can use. I will be presenting a few written questions from the chat box, and I will also give opportunity for questions to be asked in person. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand, and then when I give you a chance, you can unmute yourself, present your question, and then please mute yourself again. I will collect 3 to 4 questions at a time, and then we give the presenters a chance to respond to those. I will do my best to be as fair as I can if there are a lot of questions, while also being mindful of our time available. So anyone, let me quickly open up here. I think we can start. There was one written question, and I think that's to all the presenters. The question reads, what is the effect of overcrowding, for example, in informal settlements, on children viewing sexual acts? Many boys indicate that they were anally penetrated by a teenage or younger cousin, what research was done on young perpetrators?
Thanks, Rian. I can take that question. Just to explain, we've lost Joan, unfortunately. I think her load shedding went on for longer than expected and she ran out of battery life. So we apologize, she's not here to answer questions. In terms of overcrowding, that was mentioned by one of the caregivers, that the challenges of adult sexual activity taking place in houses, not just in informal settlements, but in lower economic social settings in townships and communities. So adults were basically engaging in sexual activities in front of children. That was raised as a risk factor by one of the caregivers. And then in terms of work with young perpetrators, as Lopa mentioned, the definition of sexual violence included boys who are both victims of sexual abuse, but also actors in harmful sexual behavior. So, involving other boys or girls. So some of the boys in this research were themselves boys who had acted in terms of harmful sexual behavior. So their responses were included in here. As I said at the beginning, we didn't ask specifically about their personal experiences. We were more wanting to understand around the notions of gender and sexuality, social constructs of those, and how those might influence harmful sexual behavior. But in the literature review, in the fuller report, it does come up a lot around actually most sexual violence against boys is perpetrated by peers. It doesn't specify whether it's girls or boys. In some of the literature, in some it does, and it is often by other boys. And of course, we know that many of those boys are also have experienced some form of violence or sexual abuse themselves. So there are recognized links between that. It doesn't mean to say that all boys who are sexually abused will go on to be become actors, but that there is a significant link between that. So witnessing violence, for example, or living in a household where there is domestic abuse, or seeing violence out in the communities are all known determinants. There is a great study by Shanaz Matthews and her colleagues that summarizes all of the literature that establishes the links between violence and violence against women and violence against children. So it does look at some aspects of boys. So those are all known. And I think that this research has just added to the understanding around that, but also how notions of, socially constructed notions of masculinity and sexuality contribute further to that. I hope that answers the question.
Then, yeah, there's a lot of comments of thanks from a few different organizations. Just want to see, we have no hands at the moment. I still have a few other written questions, and maybe I can ask this one. Suzanne, you noted peer groups are often unhealthy spaces for boys. Did the research identify any possible responses to this? Then Lopa, how do the findings from South African research tie in with other global studies? Does Family for Every Child plan to expand this work further? And third question, Dumi, what are, and Suzanne as well, what are the plans for next steps with regards to this research?
Great, I will start. I also noticed there was a question in there that says that they're proposing some training. So Dumi, I'm just batting that your way for when you respond. So in terms of the peer group with the boys, I think for me, this is probably one of the most concerning findings, and just how much the boys talked about the pressure and the kind of violating environment that they were, that their friendships exist in with other boys. And so whilst no specific proposals were made around that, I think that there are definitely actions that can be taken in supporting parenting and the connection between the parents of a child and that quality of that relationship. So to make that something that children learn from, the quality of their relationship with their primary caregivers. but also perhaps to look at some issues of emotional literacy within life orientation programs at school, and also to encourage relationships between different groupings. So with boys and girls mixing more together. So the social groupings were presented as very homosocial. So it was just boys in one group and just girls in another group. And some of the research that we looked at in the literature review suggested that perhaps if that was addressed, or that perhaps boys actually would like it to be different, but don't feel like they can have friendships with girls because of this expectation that relationships with girls are linked to sex. So I think, programs that explore how we build those kind of relationships, and what it means to be a good friend, and what it means to have a relationship with somebody of a different gender or sexuality that does not involve sex, and what qualities of relationships we should be modeling to our children.
I'll take on the next
Thank you,
question.
Susan. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
You can go ahead.
You want to go ahead, Julie, because it's related, I think, and then I can.
Yes, let me go ahead. Thank you. So in terms of the plans and the next steps, I was thinking a lot about practice for us as Childline, but also as practitioners in South Africa. We, as Childline, ran a program which is the basis of the study, where we were working with boys who are presenting with harmful sexual behavior, and we worked with their parents because we saw that as important. So out of this research, I think it emphasizes the importance of such programs. And of course, we spoke a lot about resourcing or ensuring there's enough resources for programs that are showing positive results. And one of the disadvantages, of course, is we were funded for these specific programs, and when funding came to an end, we were not able to continue. But it reflects the importance of us continuing. And I think we have seen specific recommendations and also protective and risk factors that are highlighted. And I think as practitioners, we need to go back and look at how we integrate that in terms of our interventions and prevention programs. Because we can already see some of the things that we are already doing that we need to do more of. And around training, I think we really need to go back, Suzanne, to our drawing boards and revisit the program that we implemented as Childline, and look at how do we develop it further so that other practitioners can be able to be trained on it and be able to implement. Of course, it could take different forms of implementation. And already we've had some research done on our program via the Children's Institute as well. So there's a lot that can help us to strengthen the interventions and the training, should we want to look at that further. Thank you.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. I think from the family's perspective, the South Africa research definitely ties in very well with the rest of the 5 research which has been completed so far. And as I shared at the beginning, there are many similar findings. So it is again reinforcing, irrespective of the different context of sexual violence against boys, there are some similar, aspects around social norms, gender, patriarchy, masculinity that is affecting or driving sexual violence. And the whole idea as an alliance is really to see how we can then now tie in together as part of, we have now enough evidence from these, and we are also going to complete another research which is ongoing right now around caring for boys on this similar topic in Guyana. So we would in total have 7 research. And these are creating evidences of the whole need for focusing also on boys when we are talking about violence against children or reducing violence against children. the need to also focus on boys along with girls. The whole narrative around violence against children needs to have boys as well, to ensure that they too have caring families and communities to grow up. And as also mentioned by the other panelists, the whole idea is also to then, impact the cycle of violence against women and girls by, addressing their own issues of sexual abuse and violence in their experiences of childhood violence that they are facing. And from Family for Every Child's perspective, we are also considering a larger global as well as national as well as regional advocacy leading from these evidence-based research to see how we can impact not only the countries where these researchers have been implemented, but how also collectively we can influence the different countries, the policies and practices. For example, the countries in Asia are already working around national advocacy, and I know we already have been discussing around in Africa how we can as well take these advocacy efforts forward around strengthening practices and policies. That is the whole larger vision and overall improving the care for children. So it is very much aligned with the Alliance's vision and goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys. I have 2 more questions at this time. I don't see any other written questions and also no hands. So just the final questions. Suzanne, Joan isn't back. I think this would be quite relevant. This is her field of expertise. But yeah, there is a question about the possibility for the law to limit access to pornography, or how this can be used. And then also the question also wants some information on laws that limit child pornography. I guess it's open to anyone on the floor then.
So it is definitely Joan's area of expertise. Dumi, I don't know if you are familiar more with the law, the policy around this. I do know in terms of limiting access to pornography, really, I mean, it was very concerning how many boys raised accessing or being exposed to pornography, and that this was like used as a learning, how they learn about sexuality, looking at pictures of love, they would describe it as on social media. So I definitely think that more is needed around that. And we can't just be saying that, parents need to be limiting children's online usage. I think that the media has a responsibility, and certainly in the policy environment, there is a responsibility also to look at that. I know that there is work being done around that. Dumi, I don't know if you have more specific updates on that.
Thank you, Suzanne. So we do have legislation that speaks to this. For example, the Films and Publications Act, it speaks to that. And I've just seen through the most recent information where it is stated that the president has signed the Cyber Crimes Bill, which seeks to bring South African cybersecurity law in line with the rest of the world. And that also includes sharing of information, of course, inciting violence, but also related to content that has intimate images. So what we could do is to provide a brief in terms of legislation pertaining to pornography, and we can also look at the work that is done by the Human Rights Commission, and we can probably send it together with the presentation, Suzanne, so that people can have access and reference to those details.
And may I come in, Rian, just to add in from the UN perspective, as many of us might know, because of the pandemic, there has been reports of an increased activities of children using the digital world. And as a result, very recently, the UNCRC has published a guidance around making the digital world safe for children across the different countries and the world. So that could probably be a good starting point for any advocacy on that account. Thank you.
I see we have two hands, so I'm going to get the two questions and then the panel can respond to them. First person, is it Maleche Mapoto?
Yes, good day, everyone. It's not really a question, but it's a comment based on the issue around exposure of children to pornography and access to child pornography. So I am from the Film and Publication Board. And what I wanted to say is to add to what Dumi was saying is that, yes, there is legislation, the Film and Publication Act, which specifically states that the creation, the distribution, the possession and production of child pornography is illegal in South Africa, and obviously it's punishable by law. So as a child protection officer, we get a lot of cases where people are distributing, they are creating child pornography, and all of those cases obviously end up in court because it's a criminal offense. So yes, in South Africa, we've got legislation that actually deals with child pornography, making sure that whatever report comes through of such content is then taken through the legal route and making sure that every person who's involved is punished according to the law, which normally results in prison time. And what we've also recorded is that when it comes to child pornography, is usually linked to child sexual abuse, whether it be it rape or sexual assault of any form against a child. The two usually go together with the cases that we deal with. And now when we look at the issue of media as a whole, the issue that, for example, children being able to view pornographic content online, whether it's child pornography or any form of adult pornography, erotica, content, the SA law reform is actually now busy with a paper, a sexual offences bill that they want to put forward, whereby the aim is to make sure that whoever gives a child access to a device, or a manufacturer or a distributor who gives a child access to a device whereby there's no filtering software, whereby a child can have access to pornographic content, then that person will be dealt with according to the law and it will be a criminal offense. So there is work being done in order to make sure that the responsibility just doesn't lie with parents of the child only, but the person who is distributing any form of technology or device also takes responsibility for their work and for their actions, and also responsibility for ensuring that children are not exposed to harmful content, nor are they exposed to pornography of any kind when they interact online. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that insightful comment. Charmaine.
Thank you very much, Jace. I also don't have a question. I also want to add to the previous comment. It's just to highlight that we also have the, I'm from the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, and there's also the Criminal Law, Sexual Offences and Related Matters Amendment Act, which also defines child pornography and then prohibits the distribution or creation of that, then defining it as a sexual offense. And then also, I think we also need to highlight the dangers of children engaging in what we term as sexting, and the risk of them being then included in the national National Register for Sex Offenders. If the court finds that there are enough circumstances to warrant their inclusion into that, which can have dire consequences for them in later life, not being able to work with children. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, I see there are no more hands and no more questions posed. So I'm going to hand over to Suzanne, who is going to conclude the webinar for us.
Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Again, we apologize for the hiccup with entering the webinar and the limits on Zoom. We had specifically addressed that beforehand, so we're not quite sure why that happened. But we're grateful that there's many of you could join us as possible. And just to say that the report, I will send it round to all those who filled in that Google form. It'll come via email to you a link to access the report, and we will also share the presentation. But that I would really strongly encourage you actually to join the Changemakers for Children practice, the community of practice. There's lots of interesting webinars and exchanges that happen and take place there, and it's specifically looking at linking practitioners from different contexts with each other. And so you can join that, you can access that through the Changemaker for Children's platform. I will also email you a link to that if you have not already received it. I think that it is posted there in the chat box too. You can just click directly on that. Yeah, so thank you so much for joining us today. Many of you will have received my email address, so if you do have any follow-on questions, please do get hold of us. We're happy to engage around this, and we look forward to hopefully engaging with you further in the future with our follow-up activities. Thank you so much, and goodbye.